kyphoscoliosis patient, and I got Dr. Shruti from Bangalore, right, Shruti?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and she's going to present the kyphoscoliosis for surgical correction. Yeah, Shruti, you can start.
Um, okay, sir.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Today I'll be presenting a kyphoscoliosis presentation. Here is a 10-year-old male named Samir, residing in Ramnagar, Bangalore, admitted with complaints of deformity in the back since birth.
All right.
Patient,
So this is just a basic cosmetic disfigurement, right? That's the only reason for presentation.
yes, sir.
All right. So they found some deformity in the back, which is since birth, and they are presenting at the age of 10. Can you tell me why it was not noticed? Was it congenitally diagnosed, and why it was not treated? Any history from the patient?
Sir, when the boy went to school, he had a problem. So, like,
I mean, it was minimally at the birth, and it was progressed over the period of 10 years. And over the period of 10 years, the parents would have noticed it's going to cause some cosmetic disfigurement, and that's the reason they are coming to the hospital. Is that so?
yes, sir.
Okay, fine.
Patient's mother noticed deformity in the back since birth, slowly progressive in nature along with the child's growth. Fast increase seen since 1 year associated with limping. A deformity not corrected on lying down position. So he uses pillow support. There is no history of any back pain, difficulty in walking, no history of shortness of breath, cough or weight loss, no history of fever, palpitations or syncopal attacks, no
Okay,
history of
hold on.
uh,
Yeah, hold on here. So you said the patient is having deformity in the back since birth, which is
yes, sir.
slowly progressive, and over the last 1 year, it has
Yes.
been rapidly aggressive. Is there any reason? Could be the reason. Any causes that could have made the progression very fast in the last 1 year?
Sir, it might be due to the um, spinal growth, sir, like growth of the.
Yeah, I think that deformity, when the each individual bones get osteogenesis and become the mature bone, what happens? There lay unequal growth. Okay, so initially it might be slowly progressive, but once the natural growth of the child catches up, because of the some genetic abnormality or some idiopathic reasons, that bone is not growing properly, whereas the other part of the same bone is growing properly. What happens? That discrepancy causes to have that deformity to be grow in a much progressive way. So that's how the case, the natural history will be. And you said there is no back pain and difficulty in walking. So what does it mean to you?
Sir,
You said there is no history of back pain and no difficulty in walking.
yes, sir, because there like there is no.
So what does it indicate? What does it indicate? There is no back pain and there is no difficulty in walking. So when do you get this type of symptoms? I'm asking you another way.
There's no neurological deficit.
Yes, so that's the only thing. Okay, so this is only still a bony abnormality, which is being progressive and causing cosmetic disfigurement. But fortunately, there is no back pain secondary to any discompression or secondary to any neurological compression. And there is no any spinal cord or nerve involvement, which is the reason why the patient is not having any difficulty in walking. Okay. Even if the patient has got a mild to moderate nerve compression, they tend to have a muscle weakness that can cause partial weakness or partial deficit. But since the patient is not having any difficulty in walking and no history of low back pain, that clearly indicates that there is no any neurological involvement as of now. Okay, because there are so many reasons why do we operate kyphoscoliosis. One important reason is involvement of neurological structures. The moment you start feeling neurological deficit or neural compression of spinal cord involvement, so that means the patient's deformity has to be corrected as soon as possible. Okay, that is the reason why do you ask any back pain or difficulty in walking. Okay,
Okay, sir.
right, fine. Next one, you said no shortness of breath, no cough, weight loss. So what are the reasons for this one?
Sir, weight loss may be due to the tuberculosis, sir.
Okay, weight loss, you're asking for tuberculosis,
Yes,
but
sir.
tuberculosis induced kyphoscoliosis is very, very unusual in pediatrics. Okay, so the neural tuberculosis is very, very unusual in pediatrics. That too, To cause a kyphosis secondary to TB spine, it generally starts in the middle-aged female, okay, between 30s and 40s. So unusual in a kid, because even if the patient is having a TB spine, it is too early to produce kyphoscoliotic or spine deformity at this age, okay. Probably some congenital, any tumors, okay, any rapidly growing tumors, right, can cause a sudden increase in the deformity getting progressive much faster, like any spinal cord tumor, extradural tumors, or any bony tumors, or any metastatic tumors. One possible way that could cause a weight loss in the patient, and that can be one cause for having a scoliosis. Okay, TB is one of the reason, but it is very unusual, right? So tuberculosis, malignancy.
Okay.
Okay, then shortness of breath and cough.
Breath may be due to the pulmonary artery hypertension, sir. Like if the patient is having right heart failure.
Okay, so you think this patient is having right heart failure. What is the reason for right heart failure in these patients?
Because of the kyphoscoliosis, sir, there is because of the chest deformity.
Okay.
It causes pressure on the pulmonary artery, which causes
So you need a direct mechanical pressure on the pulmonary vessels, and that is causing the pulmonary hypertension.
Yes, sir.
Is that what you meant? So direct mechanical compression of the pulmonary vessels.
Yes, sir.
Okay, is that what you mean? So this is again, it depends upon where actually the scoliosis. Okay. So generally, when you upper thoracic scoliosis, like from low cervical to upper thoracic level, if we're having a severe deformity, okay, at that level, we generally tend to have the midline shift or the mediastinal shift that can cause mechanical compression of the pulmonary arteries, which is again unusually, very, very rare part to see a direct mechanical compression of pulmonary artery, and patient will be very, very symptomatic. Okay. Direct compression of pulmonary arteries generally results in a severe symptoms. Okay. So again, of course, this is a possible reason for having a pulmonary hypertension. But any other reason for having a shortness of breath, cough?
COPD.
COPD in a 10-year-old boy. Okay, maybe from congenital disorders like cystic fibrosis or bronchiectasis. Okay, fine. Or in our roughly, you can take it as infection, right? Any silent infection in this type of patients can result in exaggerated shortness of breath and breathing difficulty or cough. Can you tell me why? Normally, in a 10-year-old boy, if you have an infection, it will not be that severe. But generally, this type of patients, if they have a silent chest infection, they could progress very rapidly in terms of shortness of breath or cough or whatever symptoms it is. Can you tell me why?
Mm.
In other terms, can you tell me what happens to the respiratory system in these patients?
Respiratory, like,
That is what I'm more concerned about.
yes.
Restrictive type of lung.
There,
Okay, Restal, please be quiet, please. So you are answering, right, Shruti?
yes, sir.
Yeah. So what could be the reason for shortness of breath or cough, if at all the patient is having?
Patient, there'll be restrictive lung.
One reason you told, direct mechanical compression of pulmonary vessels. Fine, agreed.
Yes, sir.
What are other possible reason for shortness of breath or cough if the patient presents? Second thing I told, infection. Infection in this patient, specifically infection is more important because this patient, when they get lower respiratory tract infection, they present much earlier and they present in a much severe form. Reason?
The cardiopulmonary reserve is very low.
Okay, cardiopulmonary reserve is poor. Reason? That's what I'm questioning. Infection in a normal 10-year-old boy, and infection in this boy is going to be completely in a different pattern. Right. So what happens when a normal child is there? Let's assume a normal kid of 10 years is having lower respiratory tract infection. What happens and how do they present normally?
Normal, sir.
Yeah. So let's assume a normal child, okay, who is
Yes.
not having any scoliosis, but presenting with you with a chest infection. How do they present normally?
They'll have cough,
Okay, they have cough. Fine, agreed.
um, a fever,
Fever, tachypnea,
tachypnea. Yes.
okay, tachycardia, accessory muscles usage, right?
Yes.
This is what a normal 10-year-old kid with a severe respiratory tract infection they present. Okay. The same symptoms this patient also tend to have if they have an infection, but all the symptoms will be very severe and much earlier. Why? We said the cardiopulmonary reserve is less. Agreed. But what is the reason for that? Not all kids are having a low cardiopulmonary reserve, but this patient tend to have a low cardiopulmonary reserve. And what is the reason for that?
Because of the mechanical
Okay, fine. So why does a normal kid get tachypneic when there is a chest infection? I'm asking very simple. You said a normal kid who's got a chest infection is getting
Yeah.
tachypneic, tachycardic. But what is the reason why the kid is getting tachypneic when they have a respiratory tract infection? You didn't get my point?
I got, sir. I got.
Yeah, tell me. So what happens when there is infection in the body? Okay, it's a hypermetabolic state, right? When there is hypermetabolic state, what happens? There is increased carbon dioxide production, okay, in the body. This increased carbon dioxide production is going to stimulate the brainstem, okay, and that is going to increase the respiratory system response in terms of increased depth as well as increased respiratory rate. That increases the minute ventilation, okay, and this is the reason for tachypnea. One reason. Second thing, infection when it is affecting the lung parenchyma, they tend to be hypoxic, right? Gas exchange is poor. When the blood hypoxemic concentration is going to go down, what happens? The PA out is going to go down. That is going to stimulate the chemoreceptors. When the chemoreceptors are stimulated, that is again back to the brainstem, stimulate the respiratory system, that is going to produce tachypnea and minute ventilation. This is what happens normally for any kid who is having a severe respiratory tract infection. Right. So this is the reason for tachypnea. But this patient, right, this type of kid, they tend to have the similar response, but in a very severe way. I'm asking what is the reason?
Because there will be carbon dioxide retention in these patients, sir. Like
Of course, carbon dioxide retention will happen because of the increased production, but the severity of all the symptoms like tachypnea, tachycardia, cough, fever, everything will be much sooner and much earlier in this kid. What could be the reason?
because of the decrease in lung volumes.
Yeah, that's the point. Okay, that is the point I'm expecting you, right? So this patient, they tend to have an infection. They present very early and in a very severe form, basically because of the lung is not a good organ for gas exchange, or lung is not appropriate compared to a normal kid. So what is the reason for lung not being functioning properly? All the response like CO2 retention, hypoxemia, all will stimulate the brainstem. The kid will be tachypneic, but the tachypnea will not be sufficient enough to push the carbon dioxide outside. Okay, so the response generated by the normal kid will be generated by the same kid, but the eventual ultimate why those things are happening will not be corrected in this kid, mainly because lung is not appropriate, lung is not in a good capacity. And what is the reason for that?
Because of if the patient is having thoracic scoliosis, sir,
Okay,
there will be decrease in lung volumes.
okay.
So, mainly
One is the space for the lung is restricted, right?
yes, sir.
Say for example, if there is a scoliosis like this, what happened? This one chest wall is compressed, right? One chest wall, there will be narrow space. So the space for the one lung is going to get reduced. So that decrease the functional capacity. Okay, or the vital capacity or the total lung volumes gets affected. But what happens, there will be compensatory emphysema in the other lung. Okay, the other lung tend to expand and try to overcome the restricted lung. Okay, so if until there is no any additional trigger or additional any infection, these lungs, the hyperemphysematous lungs on the other side, tend to compensate for the lungs which is shrinked. Okay, so that is how they run a normal life. Whereas when there is an infection, right, when the hyperemphysematous lung which is compensating for the lung which is restricted, when there is an infection here, what happens? All the symptoms which I said is going to produce in an exaggerated way, and they're going to present much earlier because the reserve is actually going to be very poor. Already one lung is compromised. When the lung which is functioning and overcoming that compromised lung is getting affected by some infections, they tend to have a low threshold for presenting very, very earlier. Okay, that is one thing. One is low space. Second thing, why lung is not a good organ for gas exchange in this type of patients. Once you said space is less, then
And all the total lung capacity, everything will be decreased.
okay, that's why I said lung capacity, lung is shrunken, no space, fine. Then
And our work of breathing is increased. Maximum.
yeah, work of breathing is increased because lung is shrunken, lung is small, fine. Any other reason for increased work of breathing?
There will be decreased inspiratory forces like
Okay, people are answering in the chat. Yeah, I'm waiting for the answer. I'm expecting the answer from you. Okay. One is all inspiratory capacity, work of breathing, everything is gone. Work of breathing, one reason, as I said, there is low space for the lungs. There is another important reason I'm asking you.
Decreased complaint.
Decrease in the compliance of what?
Lung.
lung
Both lungs, okay. Because of the restricted space, lung has become small, shrunken. So there is decrease in the compliance. Any other reason? Most important reason.
Muscle weakness. Respiratory muscle weakness.
Respiratory muscle weakness, fine. Any other thing? It is the compliance of the chest wall, okay? Not the lungs majorly. It is a compliance of the chest wall which is poor, okay? So for example, if there is a normal lungs, you got a sternum here and the ribs are like this, right? This is a normal chest wall, okay? What happens in a scoliotic kid? What happens when there is a curvature on the back? What happens, at one side, the rib spaces will be more. At one side, the ribs will be much crowded like this. So compared to this lung, the mechanical advantages of this lung is this chest wall is completely lost. Okay, so this chest wall can down and elevate the chest and open up the anteroposterior as well as the transverse diameter of chest, very expanded and offer a good space for the lung to expand if at all the lung is trying to expand. Okay, this is the bucket handle movement. Okay, it comes down and it elevates. By doing so, it increases the anteroposterior diameter as well as the transverse diameter. Okay, and the vertical diameter is increased by the diaphragmatic movements. Whereas assume this chest wall where one side there is crowded ribs, one side there is increased space between the ribs. So when this bucket handle movement is lost and already a shrunken lung, which is losing the added advantages of chest wall compliance, what happens? That becomes a poor coordination between the lung movement as well as the chest wall movement. So these are the two important reasons why the patients tend to have, why the lung tend to have and act as a poor gas exchange organ. And this is the reason why infection tend to present much earlier in kyphoscoliosis patients. Okay, one is lung is small, all the capacities, all the lung volume is small or restricted because lung hasn't got any space. Compensatorily, the compensatory emphysema happens on the other side, but that compensating lung, if it is infected by infection, what are additional compensation the body can have? It can use its chest wall. Again, the chest wall is highly not compliant, it's poorly compliant in this patient, so that makes the patient to have a high risk of having respiratory failure, even with a milder lower respiratory tract infection. Okay. So one is lung is bad, another is chest wall is bad. Okay, these are the two reasons why the patient tend to have shortness of breath and cough, even with a milder infection. One is a direct pulmonary compression. Second thing is infection. Any other thing why the patient could have shortness of breath and cough? Okay, Yeah, tell me.
Growth of the lungs may be impaired during the development. So if it is between 4 to 8 years, the growth of the
The growth of,
lung,
you mean the lung growth? Do you think lung wouldn't have growth by 10 years?
so the number of alveoli.
Okay, right. The anatomical structure maybe of lung is getting affected because since it's a congenital problem, so anatomical structural growth of the lung might be poor, right? Right. That could be one reason. Fine. Very common reason for shortness of breath and cough. So one is direct pulmonary artery compression causing pulmonary hypertension. Is there any other way the patient could develop pulmonary hypertension?
So impaired gas exchange.
Okay, so when these patients tend to have impaired gas exchange because of the poor expansion of the lung, so that can result in chronic hypoxemia. Okay, so when there is chronic hypoxia in the lungs, what happens? There will be pulmonary hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, isn't it?
Yes.
To improve the gas exchange. So upon chronic hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, what happens to the pulmonary vasculature?
Vasoconstriction, sir.
They tend to get stiff. Okay, upon pulmonary vasoconstriction for longer time, all the adventitial muscles of pulmonary vasculature, they tend to have growth, cellular abnormalities. Okay, they tend to get fibrosed, so that results in stiffness and
Pulmonary.
produces permanent pulmonary hypertension. Okay, so this is the reason why they, most importantly, we operate the kids before they're going for permanent pulmonary hypertension. When the patient has got a severe pulmonary hypertension, we can't operate, and that's a relative contraindication for having the surgery. Okay, good. So other important thing, basically, there are two types of alveolar vessels in the lung. Okay, ones are called alveolar vessels, other are called the extra alveolar vessels. Okay, so pulmonary hypertension in obstructive pulmonary disease is different, whereas pulmonary hypertension in restrictive lung disease is different. Say, for example, this is a peripheral alveoli. Okay, these are the main bronchus, and these are the terminal or the branches of the bronchi. So what happens? There are two types of vessels, as I said. One is a capillary which is supplying the alveoli. This is called as the alveolar capillaries. And there are capillaries running in the bronchi. These are all called extra alveolar capillaries, right? So in a patient with a larger lung volume, okay, like for example, in a COPD patients or emphysematous patients, what happens? The basic problem is their alveoli don't deflate fully, so the alveoli is very big. When the alveoli is very big, they compress these vessels. Okay, the alveolar capillaries are compressed. So this is the reason for pulmonary hypertension in obstructive lung disease. So alveolar capillaries are compressed, so that increases the pulmonary vascular resistance, and that can cause pulmonary hypertension. Whereas on the paradox, in the restrictive lung diseases like a kyphoscoliosis induced reduced lung expansion, what happens? The alveoli are very small, right? Because the lung is small, the alveoli tend to be very small. When the lung is very small, when the lung is not expanding, all the alveolar capillaries will be fine. They don't have any problem. Whereas the extra alveolar vessels, because of the lung getting shrunken, these vessels are getting squashed. These getting compressed. So here the pulmonary hypertension is mainly because of the squashing of the extra alveolar vessels. There it's going to be alveolar vessels. Here it's going to be extra alveolar vessels. Okay. So this is the difference between pulmonary hypertension in a patient with restrictive lung disease and in a patient with obstructive lung disease. Got the point?
Yes, sir.
Other
So
guys,
please repeat.
you want me to repeat? Other guys, unmute and tell me whether they're able to understand this point clearly.
Yes, sir.
Sir, please repeat it, sir.
Okay. Let's assume this is going to be obstructive lung disease, right? Where there is an obstruction of this bronchus. Okay. So what happens? The air that comes in cannot get out. Okay. So what happens? This balloon keeps on expanding, and which we call it as dynamic hyperinflation. When the alveolus keep on expanding, what happens to the alveolar capillaries which are feeding that? They're getting compressed. Okay. So this compression of alveolar vessels is the reason for increased pulmonary vascular resistance, and that is causes pulmonary hypertension in obstructive lung disease. Okay. Whereas in a restrictive lung disease, there are other types of vessels in the lungs. As I told, these are the extra pulmonary vessels which are running around the bronchus. Okay. So in restricted lung disease, the alveoli is small because the lung is not expanding. So the pulmonary capillaries, which is supplying the alveoli, are not compressed. Whereas because the lung is getting shrunken and small, they tend to squeeze the vessels around the main bronchus or the branching of the bronchus. So the extra alveolar vessels are compressed. When those vessels are compressed, again pulmonary vascular resistance is getting increased, and that is causing pulmonary hypertension. So extra alveolar vessels compression in the restricted lung diseases, alveolar vessels compression in obstructive lung disease. Okay. Good. So these are the 4 different reasons why the patient tend to have shortness of breath or cough. Okay, one is direct mechanical compression of the pulmonary artery because of the level of scoliosis. Second thing is infection. Third thing is anatomically lung is not properly developed, or when the congenital diaphragmatic hernias or any diaphragmatic abnormalities, any congenital abnormalities in the lung and the diaphragm. And the last thing is chronic hypoxia that eventually resulting in having a pulmonary hypertension. These are 4 different reasons why the patient tend to have shortness of breath and cough. Right, Shruti, we can go ahead now.
Okay, sir.
Next, you ask the
Then-
patient is not having fever, palpitation, syncopal attacks. What is the reason for these things?
Sir, fever because if patient has any infections,
Okay, infection.
fever and palpitations.
Okay,
Syncopal attacks, if the patient is having congenital heart diseases.
okay, fine. You're looking to rule out any congenital heart disease since it's a genetic condition from birth. You're looking for any congenital heart disease. Fine. Okay, right. And this one?
Sir,
Next one. You said no history of PND and orthopnea, right?
yes, sir.
What is the reason for asking this history?
Sir, in the in heart failure, if patient is having pulmonary artery hypertension
Okay.
and progresses to right heart failure, patient might have orthopnea and dyspnea.
Orthopnea or PND are right heart failure or compared to left heart failure? Orthopnea and PND are symptoms of right heart failure or left heart failure?
Left heart.
They're more of left heart failure, okay? Orthopnea, PND are predominantly left heart failure signs, okay? When the patient tend to have left heart failure in a patient with COPD? In a patient with kyphoscoliosis. Right heart failure is common, as we discussed already. Because
Yes,
of the pulmonary hypertension development, they can result in carpulmonary right heart failure. But when do the patient develop left heart failure?
If the patient is having a mitral valve prolapse, like in Marfan syndrome.
Okay, fine. Marfan syndrome is one cause for having kyphoscoliosis, right? So any congenital cardiac abnormality which is associated with the condition causing kyphoscoliosis, fine. So that could be one reason. Unusually, when carpulmonary, okay, in patient with right heart failure, as we discussed in the last class, so in right heart failure, the right ventricle is going to be dilated, okay? When the tend to get dilated, they're going to push the interventricular septum towards the left side. So the left ventricular size is going to get decreased, okay? So when the left ventricular size is decreased, they're going to have a reduced preload because they can't accommodate large amount of volume coming from the left atrium. That eventually results in low cardiac output and the left heart failure symptoms, okay? So that's a one possible way the patient can develop left heart failure. Otherwise, left heart failure is very unusual unless the patient is having any congenital associated cardiac anomalies. Fine. Trauma and muscle weakness. What is the reason for this problem?
In muscular dystrophies and in trauma, vertebral trauma,
Okay.
patient might.
All right. So when there is a trauma, that could be cause of scoliosis, or when patient with myopathic disorders, they can have a scoliosis. So that's the reason you're asking these questions. Fine. So the history of any kyphoscoliosis patient should focus on what is a possible causative reason for having the scoliosis. Second thing, how the scoliosis has affected the patient's quality of life. Okay. Third thing, the patient is having any additional abnormalities apart from having directly related to the kyphoscoliosis, apart from any additional condition the patient could have. So these are the three primary focus you have to look off in the history. Of course, you have asked the majority of the things. You have asked for associated cardiac problems. You have asked associated any neurological deficit. Fine. You have asked associated any chest infection. Additionally, you asked what could be the reasons for all the kyphoscoliosis which has been presenting. Okay. So this is how the kyphoscoliosis history should focus on. Causative for kyphoscoliosis, effect of kyphoscoliosis on the patient's body, then any additional conditions which could be associated with kyphoscoliosis. These are three things you should focus on the history. Right. So can you tell me what are the different causes for kyphoscoliosis or scoliosis?
Sir, causes can be idiopathic, congenital, or acquired, sir.
Okay, idiopathic, fine. What is the most common reason?
Genetic inheritance, sir.
Idiopathic or genetic. Okay, so it is 70% of the scoliosis daily due to idiopathic due to genetic reasons. Fine. What are other causes?
Other causes can be acquired neuromuscular disorders like muscular dystrophies.
Okay, neuromuscular disorders, right? Neuromuscular disorders. What are the neuromuscular disorders which can cause scoliosis?
Sir, muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy,
Muscular
poliomyelitis.
dystrophies, right? Cerebral palsy, poliomyelitis. Okay, fine. These are the neuromuscular causes for scoliosis. Fine. Then what are the other causes for scoliosis?
And rheumatoid arthritis and
Right? Mesenchymal disorders. Okay. Mesenchymal disorders like rheumatoid arthritis. Fine. Still's disease.
disease, osteogenesis.
Osteogenesis imperfecta. Fine. Then what are the disorders you know? What are the other causes?
Sir, neurofibromatosis, sir.
Neurofibromatosis. Very good. Then
And tumors, meningomyelocele.
okay, so congenital conditions. Okay, congenital conditions which can be open or which can be closed. Open conditions, example, meningomyelocele
Yes, sir.
and diastrophyta. Or sorry, open spina bifida occulta. Okay, closed congenital spine problems, diastrophyta. Okay, right. Some of the extravertebral causes for kyphoscoliosis like congenital fusion of ribs. Other genetic conditions like Marfan's and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Right. And lastly, trauma, tumor, infections.
Yes.
Okay. So these are the different causes for kyphoscoliosis, of which idiopathic or the genetic reason is reason for 70% of the scoliosis which comes to you. Okay, neuromuscular scoliosis, each scoliosis has got different issue. Like for example, neuromuscular scoliosis, they tend to bleed horribly because the muscle tend to contract very poorly when the surgeon try to expose the spine. Okay, so apart from idiopathic scoliosis, these are the other reasons why the patient tend to have kyphoscoliosis. Okay, good. Excellent. So shall we move on to next one?
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Perinatal history, non-consanguineous marriage, full-term delivery by LSCS, and delivery was uneventful. No history of prolonged or difficult delivery. Baby cried immediately after birth.
Okay.
And,
you are looking for any birth injuries? Is that you mean?
Yes, sir. Prolonged syndromic neuromuscular scoliosis.
Okay. Right. So fully immunized and no other medical problems from childhood. Okay. Right. Good. Nothing much significant here. Right. Here.
Family history. Patient lives with parents and elder brother. No history of similar complaints in the family.
Okay.
Personal history.
Right. So all the bowel bladder habits, everything is fine. And what is the developmental history? Development is fine.
Yes, sir. Development is
Developmental history is fine.
developmental delay.
When you're treating with any genetic disorder or congenital disorder, make sure you ask for the developmental history of the child. Okay.
Yes.
That's more important, right? No drug allergies, no previous surgeries. Okay, fine. Right.
General physical examination. Baby is poorly built and nourished. Height is 110 centimeters. Weight is 21 kg. BMI is 17 kg per meter square. No history of pallor, icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, pedal edema, or generalized lymphadenopathy. Vitals, pulse 94 beats per minute, regular rhythm, normal volume, no radioradial or radiofemoral delay. BP is 160 mmHg, right upper limb in supine position. Respiratory rate is 22 cycles per minute, abdominothoracic, regular, and his afebrile.
Okay, good.
And airway examination is done in sitting position. Mouth opening is adequate, 6
All
centimeters.
right. So this again, depending upon the level of where the scoliosis you find, the good thing is cervical scoliosis is very, very rare. Okay. So that's why we don't face any airway difficulties in general. But when the patient is having low cervical or upper thoracic involvement, make sure your airway is absolutely fine, because they can have a restricted neck extension could be difficult. In addition, if the patient is having neuromuscular scoliosis or any neurological deficit in the upper limbs, and that can pose an airway difficulties, because you can't extend the neck, and that's the reason why airway has to be focused much more in this patient, more than the mouth opening and the dentition. More importantly, the neck extension and neck flexion degrees has to be noticed very much in this type of patients coming for surgery. Okay, so in this patients you got neck extension and flexion, everything are fine, so which means it is not involving the cervical spine. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Now coming to examination of spine, inspection from back, position of the head and hairline or midline, level of shoulder, left side shoulder lower than the right side, prominence of the scapula present on the left side, lateral margin of the trunk is more curved on the left side. Curvature
Okay.
of spine, scoliosis is present with convexity on the right side, deformity extending from thoracic to lumbar region, smooth contour, rib hump is present, and there are no signs of spinal raphism like patch of hair or dimple. Inspection from the front, trachea is
So you mean
midline.
the scoliosis is like this, okay? Left side is more prominent and the convexity is on the right side, okay?
Yes, sir.
So let's assume this is left side and this is right side. So the convexity is towards the right and the concavity is towards the left. Left scapula is more prominent and it is located. What is the uppermost level of the scoliosis?
Sir, T4, sir. T5.
T5. So
T5.
T5.
Yes,
Okay, this you have to mention when you do an examination. Okay, find the
sir.
uppermost level. All right, right. So no any congenital signs like patches of hair and dimple. Very good.
Inspection from front,
Okay.
trachea is in midline, rib cage is prominent anteriorly on the left side and posterior on the right side. Crowding of the ribs present in the lower ribs region. There are no ulcers present. Position of anterior superior iliac spine is higher on the right side. Inspection from the side, kyphoscoliosis is present in the thoracolumbar region. Inspection of the foot and skin. No, there is no asymmetric foot size, flat foot or flat foot. No neurocutaneous markers like cafe or spots or axillary freckles.
Okay, fine. So it is basically a single curve or a double curve.
So compensated curve is there in the lumbar region, sir.
No, no. The curve, if say for example, when you're looking at the scoliosis, there are two types. Okay, one it can be a single curve like this. Okay, all right. Other times it can be like this. So I'm asking whether the patient is having a single curve or a double curve.
Single curve, sir.
It's only a single curve, and which is
Yes.
more of in the thoracolumbar region, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Because double curve is going to put extra bit of risk in terms of when it comes to the surgical correction, because when the surgical duration is going to get more, you're going to have a more blood loss. Okay, so that's the
Yes.
reason why you have to notice a single curve or a double curve, and there is crowding of ribs on one side naturally. And what happens, when the patient is having a curvature, okay, so what happens, the vertebra and the spinous process tend to get rotated on the concave side. Okay, what happens is they, instead of, when you just see a vertebral structure, right? This is a vertebral body, and this is the pedicle, and this is the lamina spinous process, right? So this is a normal in a midline. So what happens, when the patient is having a scoliosis on the concavity towards the concave side, the vertebra tends to get rotated like this. So they tend to get rotated towards an angle. So when they tend to get rotated towards the concave side, what happens, it tends to pull the ribs towards them when they tend to, because the ribs is attached at the costochondral junction. So when they tend to open up the concavity, I mean they turn up towards the concave side, they what happen is they tend to pull the ribs on one side. So that is the reason for crowding of ribs on the side which is having the concave. So since it's a left side curve, you get a crowding of ribs as it is pulling the ribs together. Okay. So this is the reason for curving. I mean the crowding of ribs. Good. Okay. What is the time in the palpation?
Sir, there is no tenderness, and there is no tenderness on the spine, and there is no costopelvic tenderness.
Okay.
Deformity is present from T5 to L2 region. There
So
are
it
no
is
other.
almost involving 8 vertebrae, right?
Yes, sir.
8, 9, almost 10 vertebrae.
Yes.
So the number of vertebral involvement is important when you assess a patient, because that is going to decide how much the bleeding the patient is to have, or how intense the surgical correction is going to be. Okay, right. So 10 vertebrae are getting involved from T5 to L2 level. No other swelling and absent muscle spasm. Okay, right. Good. What is meaning by the term compensated scoliosis?
Sir, compensated scoliosis means when the patient is patient bent, the scoliosis is not corrected, sir. Like there is no
Okay, so in adults, in adults generally, some type of scoliosis happens because of the pure muscle spasm. Okay, they tend to limp because of the low back pain due to muscle spasm. Anything, when they tend to limp for a longer side, like if you take a knee arthritis patients. Okay, when the patient tend to have knee arthritis, what happens? They tend to lag on one side of the leg. So when they have a limping for quite longer time, the muscle which has been hanging the entire weight on the one side of the paraspinal muscles, they tend to be very stiff. The other side of the paraspinal muscle tend to be weaker. Okay, so this imbalance in the muscle on one side, other side tend to produce a functional scoliosis. When you correct the actual pathology, the scoliosis tend to get corrected on its own. Okay, so those are all called as the functional scoliosis. Okay, so that happens specifically when this patient is having a muscle spasm secondary to any imbalance due to induced by the osteoarthritis knee or any low back pain or any muscle spasm. All right, good. So this patient is not having that. It's a fixed one, right?
yes.
And next thing.
Coming to systemic examination, respiratory system inspection. Trachea appears central. Shape of the chest. There's a lateral bending of spine towards the right side in thoracic region. Respiratory movements are equal on the both sides. Chest expansion is more on the right. There are no usage of accessory muscles of respiration.
Okay.
No swelling, scars, or visible pulsations seen. Palpation, inspectory findings are confirmed. There is no tenderness. Vocal frequencies are heard. Resonant percussion, resonant heard, note heard over all areas of the chest. Auscultation, bilateral normal vesicular breath sound.
Basically, apart from the anatomical abnormality of chest wall, nothing significant.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so there is only bending of the spine and the bending of the chest on one side, and but lung per se is not affected much. So that's what you infer from your respiratory system examination. Fine. Okay, CNS, there is no deficit. All the neurological functions are absolutely normal. Deep and reflex, everything is fine. Sensory is normal, right? So power is 5/5, right? So most importantly, why the power is important in neurological examination is in this type of patients in kyphoscoliosis, many spine centers they started doing neuromonitoring now. Okay, so generally depending upon the preoperative power of the patient, the muscle power. Okay, when you get a good power of 5/5 before inducing the patient, the chances of getting MEP signals is very high. Generally, what I have seen is when the patient muscle power is 3 or less. Okay, when the patient's muscle power has dropped on 3 or less due to spinal cord compression or any reasons in the spinal cord, generally picking up the muscle signals or MEP signals is very difficult. Or in addition, the current needed to stimulate those muscles which are having a power of less than 3, it will be very difficult. Sometimes you don't see it all throughout the surgery. MEP signals will not be noticed when the patient's muscle power is poor. So that is why you have to note what is the muscle power the surgeon has noticed in their physical examination. Though we don't do, the surgeons will definitely do the muscle power evaluation and see what is their baseline muscle power. Because intraoperatively, the neuromonitoring signals will be acquiring those signals will be difficult. If at all you acquire, they have a very low threshold to disappear, And second thing, the current threshold needed to stimulate those type of muscles which have lost their power secondary to spinal cord compression will be very difficult to pick up. Okay, you got the point.
Yes, sir.
Good. Neurological examination is fine.
And CVS, S1, S2 heard, and there are no murmurs.
Okay.
And abdomen, per abdomen, scaphoid in shape. All quadrants move equally with respiration.
Okay.
Abdomen is soft on palpation, and there is no tenderness.
Okay. Good.
Diagnosis is a 10-year-old male with right-sided compensated, probably idiopathic infantile kyphoscoliosis with no neurological deficits, posted for deformity correction.
Deformity correction. Right. So this is a simple, straightforward kyphoscoliosis without any organ involvement. Was coming for deformity correction, mainly for cosmetic reasons, right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, fine. So this is a straightforward Frank-West kyphoscoliosis. Now let's move on to discussion of how to evaluate this patient. Okay, right. So how do you evaluate anesthetically? What are the things you look for in the pre-operative assessment of this patient coming for surgery?
Sir, firstly, severity of the scoliosis, sir.
Okay, you look for the severity of the scoliosis. So what are the factors affecting the severity of scoliosis?
Um, lung involvement.
Okay, when the patient is having lung involvement.
And curves more than 60 degree will have.
Okay, Cobb's angle, right?
Yes.
Cobb's angle. So this is another important thing you have to look for. So what are the severity of Cobb's angle and the patient's clinical condition? Can you tell me?
Sir, if the Cobb's angle is less than 10 degrees, it is normal, sir.
Okay, normal.
If it is more than 25 degree, there may be echo-wise, there may be increased pulmonary artery hypertension.
So pulmonary artery hypertension can happen when there is more than 25 degrees in the Cobb's angle. Fine.
And if Cobb's angle is more than 40 degree, surgical correction is.
So generally between 40 to 50 degrees, surgical correction is indicated. Okay. So when the patient is having more than 40 degrees, surgical correction is needed. Fine.
And if the Cobb's angle is more than 65 degree, restrictive lung patterns. Like
Okay, more than 65 to 70 degrees, you tend to have restrictive lung disease. Fine.
More than 100 degrees, patient will have dyspnea on exertion.
Okay, dyspnea on exertion when the patient's angle is going to be more than 100 degrees. When the patient is more than 120 degrees, you tend to have alveolar hypoventilation. Right. So severity of scoliosis can be assessed by one if there is lung involvement straight away. When there is lung involvement, that is naturally going to be having a degree greater than 100 or 120% or 120 degrees. Fine. Second thing is you're going to look for the Cobb's angle. Okay, depending upon the Cobb's angle, you're going to assess the severity. So surgery is indicated when the disease is progressing or when the Cobb's angle is more than 40 to 50 degrees. Fine. What are other ways of assessing the severity of scoliosis? Age of
pulmonary
age of the patient. Okay.
Age of the patient.
Number of vertebrae involved.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what other thing you left? Number of vertebrae involved, age of the patient, Cobb's angle, any respiratory lung involvement, patient's baseline, pulmonary pressures.
Pulmonary.
Okay, so these are the ways of assessing the severity of scoliosis. Okay, so what are the things you evaluate in the assessment?
Complete blood count, sir.
From the assessment and preparation, you said lung is involved. You're going to look for the Cobb's angle. And do you know how to measure the Cobb's angle?
Upper horizontal line is drawn, one on the superior border of the upper end vertebrae, and the other line horizontally on the lower border of the lower vertebra, and the intersection.
So this is T5, and let's assume this is L2. Okay, so you're gonna have two horizontal line like this and one horizontal line like this, right? And then you're going to have a perpendicular line from this line and perpendicular line from this angle, right? And you're going to measure the angle of intersection.
Yes.
This is the Cobb's angle, okay? So depending upon the severity of vertebra involved, the angulation is going to be more. When the angulation is more, it is going to be more severe scoliosis. Another important thing in assessing the severity is the level of scoliosis involved, okay? If it is a lower thoracolumbar scoliosis, it's not going to be much affected, going to affect much patients based in cardiorespiratory reserve. Whereas upper thoracic or full thoracolumbar scoliosis, they tend to have, or double curves, they tend to have a severe compromise in the patient's baseline physiology. Okay, apart from Cobb's angle and number of vertebrae involved, the level of involvement of scoliosis is next thing you have to look for in assessing the severity of the scoliosis in the patient's preoperative assessment. Right. What else you do in the preoperative assessment?
And I would check for the cardiopulmonary reserve. I'll check, sir, like by asking the patient about the like.
Okay, one you said you have to assess the severity of scoliosis. Second thing, in your assessment, you have to make sure there is no any secondary effects of scoliosis on the patient's body. So that's the other way of assessing the severity. Secondary assessment like respiratory involvement. What do you see in the respiratory system in evaluating the patient?
In thoracic scoliosis, there'll be
This patient is having thoracolumbar, isn't it? So
yes.
this patient's respiratory system baseline has to be definitely evaluated in the preoperative period, right?
Yes.
So you're gonna look for patient's baseline respiratory rate. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, respiratory rate, you have to look for baseline saturation in room air.
Yes.
Okay, and then their bedside lung function test.
Yes, sir.
Right, the bedside lung function test, all the names like cough test, Sabasis test, match blowing test, everything we discussed in the last class. We're gonna do all the baseline lung because pulmonary evaluation is next most important thing you have to do in any scoliosis patient. Okay, so this is what you have to assess and prepare the patient for surgery. Okay, if the patient is having a severe respiratory environment like being the patient's pulmonary hypertension, severe pulmonary hypertension, or when the patient's forced vital capacity, right? If it is less than 35%, right? That indicates the patient is an absolute or relative contraindication for having a kyphoscoliosis corrective surgery. So these things you have to look for when you evaluate a patient coming for scoliosis correction. Okay. So severity assessment and the scoliosis involving other system assessment. That's what you do. Cardiac assessment, I think unless the patient is having leg edema or any signs of right heart failure, left heart failure, doesn't much need not do in the assessment and the preparation, right? How do you investigate this patient?
Firstly, I would do CBC with total and differential counts.
Okay, CBC, first thing is to look for the hemoglobin. Okay,
Yes.
tell this one first. Okay, hemoglobin is more important. Right, so because these surgeries tend to bleed a lot. Okay, scoliosis surgery, the main concern for one of the important vital concern for the anesthetist is the bleeding. All right, so you have to look for the hemoglobin concentration in the patient. Right, so when do you transfuse this patient preoperatively? What are the indications for transfusion?
Sir, if hemoglobin is less than 10 gram percent, sir.
Okay, is that the transfusion trigger in the pediatrics? Okay, less than 8. Okay, less than 8 grams percentage is the transfusion trigger in a patient if at all if you're planning for preoperative transfusion. Okay, so let's assume if the patient is hemoglobin of 12 grams. Okay, let's assume this patient has got 12 grams of hemoglobin. Okay, what are the strategies you adopt in order to reduce the blood transfusion in this patient? What are the different ways as an anesthetist you're going to prepare this kid to reduce allogenic blood transfusion? Because 10 years kid, you need not unnecessarily transfusion has to be avoided because you're going to expose patient to have foreign antigens or allo antibodies. So in order to reduce that, what are the different strategies you will adopt?
Sir, we can pre-donation of the preoperative donation.
Okay, preoperative autologous donation. What is preoperative autologous donation?
Sir, if hemoglobin is more than 11 gram percent,
Okay.
4 weeks before we can give erythropoietin, injection erythropoietin, 400 units per kg, and we can give, and up from two weeks before the surgery, every 4 to 7 days we can collect the blood until before 3 days we have to stop.
Okay, you can maximum collect 2 to 3 units, right? 3 units of PRBC, okay, and 2 units to 3 units per week. 2 units per week, maximum allowed in pediatrics. Okay, rest all whose mic is that? Okay, right. You can unmute Shruti, right? So 2 units per week is the maximum allowed limit for donation, and the last donation should be before 72 hours. Before 72 hours before surgery, you have to complete your last donation. In the period of patient waiting, during the waiting period, you can improve his patient's hemoglobin by giving hematinics like iron and erythropoietin like agents, which can stimulate erythropoiesis in these patients. Okay, so this is preoperative autologous donation. What is the advantage and disadvantages of giving preoperative autologous donation?
Advantages are if there is more blood loss, we can use the same patients.
That you can use even even allogenic blood. But why do you specifically using preoperative autologous blood?
So chances of
Yeah, tell me.
infection, immune reactions are less.
Okay, one is patient's own blood is given, so antibody reactions are lesser. Then,
And transfusion related
okay, all the transfusion related problem like communicable disease or transmittable disease are avoided. Okay, tell at least 2 points in each. Okay, then you can substantiate why you're giving this one, why you don't want. What are the disadvantages of preoperative autologous donation? Okay, it is not a cost effective, it is an expensive one, right? Second thing, you can't guarantee that you will transfuse the blood to back to the patient. Okay, if the patient is not bleeding much, just because you have got the blood out doesn't mean that you should retransfuse the patient. Second thing is, you cannot transfuse the same blood to some other patients if at all you're not using. Okay, it is not transmissible to other patients, right? Third thing, chances of infection, right? Bacterial contamination is high, like similar to normal allogenic blood. The preoperative autologous donated blood can also have a chances of having an infection. Okay, that can also get bacterially contaminated. Advantage associated antibody reactions are like patient's own blood is transfused, so the transfusion related immune reactions are much lesser. Okay, disadvantages, it is expensive, chances that you might not transfuse that to the patient. Other thing is you cannot transfer to the other patients, and then bacterial contamination. So these are the reasons preoperative autologous donation blood is not being followed nowadays. Okay, it has many centers have stopped doing this preoperative autologous donation. Okay, right. So this is one strategy. What are the other strategies you reduce the blood transfusion?
Sir, acute normovolemic hemodilation, sir.
Acute normovolemic hemodilution. How do you do it?
After induction, blood is hematocrit is reduced to 20 to 30% by collecting
You
blood.
can drop your hemoglobin up to 7 gram percentage. Okay, up to 7 gram, I mean hematocrit of 21. Okay, so you can withdraw blood, and simultaneously you're going to transfuse
transfuse
either
when
5% albumin, okay,
when
or 3 ml per 1 ml of blood withdrawn of crystalloid.
crystalloids.
Okay, so one side you're going to withdraw the blood, and other side you're going to transfuse albumin or crystalloid are going to fill the vascular system, right? So what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing this one?
Sir, advantages are now number of RBCs lost can be reduced.
Okay, so whatever the patient loses, that is going to be poor quality blood. So number of RBCs lost is less.
And when the bleeding actually starts, we can transfuse the blood which we have collected.
Okay, that's for the reason you're doing it. Fine. Again, the same one, transfusion related issues, right? All the transfusion related immune reactions is very, very less. Second thing is you cannot transfuse this blood. That when you come to the disadvantages, it is not transmissible again. You cannot transfuse some other patients. And again, there might not be need for transfusing this blood back when the patient is not bleeding much. Right? So that's other thing. Disadvantages. Second thing is it is also an expensive one.
Yes.
Like a normal blood collection, you have to use same anticoagulants, preservation has to be good. And again, there can be clerical errors, you can wrongly label. So this blood should not go to the blood bank, you have to preserve inside the OT in a closed preservative technique as you do in the blood bank. Okay, right. Other thing is when you
Sir,
transfuse it, yeah,
okay, sir.
when you transfuse a crystalloid or albumin, you're going to produce hemodilution. When there is hemodilution, that can affect the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, right? So if the patient is having any acute bleeding or acute hypoxia or a poor quality RBC concentration, the blood is not a good one to carry hemoglobin immediately or the oxygen immediately. So that can paradoxically or it can produce a collateral damage in causing hypoxic injury to the tissues. All right. So when you're transfusing 5% albumin or but it can produce volume overload. Okay.
Yes.
When you don't take into account the amount of fluid has to be returned back, that can eventually result in volume overload. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of giving acute normovolemic hemodilution. This has been practiced in few centers. This has been practiced in few centers, but pre-operative autologous donation is not being practiced nowadays. Okay. What are the next other strategies you advise to reduce the
Cell salvage care, salvaging of blood during
okay
surgical procedure, like
intraoperative cell salvage? Okay, this is the most important thing. Have you seen using this one?
no, sir.
Okay. This is a very, very common thing nowadays. Majority of the centers has procured this intraoperative cell salvage. Very useful mission. Right. So, what is the basic idea behind intraoperative cell salvage?
Sir, here the blood which is lost, blood cells which are lost are recovered, concentrated and washed and returned to the patient. That like 50 to 60% of the red blood cells are can be available for
Is it your
transfusion.
background which is having horrible noise?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. All right. So whatever the blood which is released from the field is to be used a separate suction. Okay. Don't use a regular surgical suction. A separate suction has to be given to the surgeon, which is in connection with the intraoperative cell salvage. So that suction, when the blood is sucked from the surgical field, it is diluted with heparin or citrate. Right. So citrate anticoagulant is getting silently diluted with it. So that will act as an anticoagulant. So once you collect sufficient volume, okay, at least the patients should bleed minimum 500 ml of blood. Okay, then only the surgery which have more than 10% of the patient's blood volume loss. When the surgery, you expect a bleeding of more than 10% of the patient blood volume. So that is the reason or indication why do you use intraoperative cell salvage. When you expect a bleeding of less than 500 ml, don't use cell salvage because it is very expensive equipment and going to be eventually get wasted. Okay. One day when you expect more than 10% of the patient's blood volume loss, or when the patient is going to expect a bleeding of more than 500 ml to 1 liter of blood loss is expected, well, in those conditions, you're going to use intraoperative cell salvage. So separate suction, it is going to be a low pressure suction because when you use a high pressure suction, that is going to damage the red blood cells. So low pressure suction recovered and then diluted with heparin. So once minimum 500 to 600 ml is collected, they are going to get centrifuged. Okay. Once centrifuge, the RBCs are going to get collected separately, right? Then they are washed with normal saline and retransfused back to the patient at the end of the surgery. Okay. So indications again, surgeries which are going to bleed more than 10% of patient total blood volume. Expected bleeding, some textbook says 500, some textbook says more than 1,000 ml. You can tell either of which is fine. Patient is having rare blood groups, okay? Rare blood groups. Fine, patient is having multiple auto antibodies where cross matching is very difficult, right? Second thing is patient refusing allogenic transfusion but accepting intraoperative cell salvage. So these are the indications for using intraoperative cell salvage in a patient to reduce the allogenic transfusion. What are the contraindications for using intraoperative cell salvage? When do you don't use?
In cancer, sir, cancer.
Okay, malignancy. Okay, either it might be primary malignancy or metastatic malignancy. So in malignant cells, if you transfuse, there is a fear of giving the tumor cells into the different part of the body. So that's why primary and metastatic malignancy, you're gonna contraindicate it, the intraoperative cell salvage. Any other contraindications? Any pharmacological contraindications? When you're using artificial fluids like betadine,
Okay.
fluorhexidine in the surgical field, don't use intraoperative cell salvage because that can't be get absorbed into the cell salvage system, right? Then physiological, like when you are having an infective focus or infective fluid, okay, when there is a pleural fluid or ascitic fluid collection in the operative field, all right, any infection, pleural fluid, ascitic fluid, or any biological fluids, bile, intestinal contents leaking there. In those conditions, don't use intraoperative cell salvage. Again, for pregnancy, when there is amniotic fluid leakage, during the time of amniotic fluid, don't use the cell saver suction, right? Then resurgeries. Resurgeries, patients having titanium implant spines. So this titanium alloys can leak their titanium contents, so that can absorb in the intraoperative cell salvage. So when you're doing resurgery or respline exploration, who already had a titanium implantation, don't use intraoperative cell salvage. Okay, so these are some of the few contraindications for using intraoperative cell. Primarily these malignancies, and when you're using surgical field betadine or chlorhexidine or any wash artificial fluids, infections, pleural fluid, ascitic fluids, bile, or any contaminants fluid in the operative field, titanium implants which are going to go for resurgeries. Third thing is when you're using bone cement. When you're using bone cement in the operative field, don't use it intraoperative cell salvage. Okay. So again, only minimum 500 ml of blood has to be collected. Then only you can wash and so that you can get at least 150 to 200 ml of packed red blood cells. So when it's less than 500 ml, you can't utilize that blood. Okay, you don't get any RBCs at all. Right. So these are the third strategies where you can reduce the transfusion requirement. What are the other ways you can reduce the transfusion requirement?
Sir, by antifibrinolytic therapy like tranexamic acid is given.
Antifibrinolytics like tranexamic acid. Very good. So PAD, autonomic normovolemic mean acute normovolemic hemodilution. Third thing is intraoperative cell salvage. Fourth one you said antifibrinolytics. Very good. Tranexamic acid or protein has been proven to reduce the intraoperative blood loss. Then
Sir, and proper positioning, sir.
positioning of the patient. Okay, positioning in the sense, what do you mean?
Sir, like there should not be any pressure on the abdomen so that the blood loss is.
No, that's different. Okay, so the surgical site, okay, the operative site should always be at a higher level compared to the heart. Okay, so that you allow the venous drainage to happen easily. So when there is any obstruction to the venous drainage from the surgical site, say for example, if you're operating on the leg, if you put the patient in supine, there will be some amount of blood loss. Whereas if you put the same patient in a head-up posture, like a reverse Trendelenburg, what happens? The heart is at the higher level from the operative side. In those cases, the venous drainage has to go against the pressure towards the heart, so that will bleed horribly. Okay, so the operative sites are always should be higher level than compared to the heart, and the heart should not be higher level compared to the operative side. Okay, so that is why if you see the spine surgeon when they try to expose, when they come to the lumbar level, they tend to put, they ask the anesthetist to give a head down. When they're operating the thoracic level, they tend to give a head up posture. This is mainly to aid the venous drainage. Okay, so positioning. Just carefully looking at the position, and of course, as I said, the abdominal thoracic compression should be free so that you don't have the venous engorgement. And then,
Yes.
what are the ways?
Sir, deliberate hypotension
Okay,
can be practiced,
uh,
but
hypotensive anesthesia. This you can be done to reduce the blood pressure, to reduce the MAP. So that's how we can reduce the blood loss from the field. Fine. Next one.
And by avoiding hypothermia, sir.
Okay,
Hypothermia.
hypothermia, very important. Okay, these are all long duration surgeries. So hypothermia has to be avoided. All the time, patient's temperature has to be kept more than 36.5 degrees. So this should be the target. Okay, at least 36 degrees. And then modification of surgical techniques. Surgeon should not be very arrogant. You should go through the facial plane and then like epinephrine soak pads. Okay, this is one strategy. Is then using proper hemostasis as you dissect plane by plane. So these are the different ways of reducing an allogenic transfusion in a patient, particularly when you expect a longer, heavy bleeding surgeries like spines, aortic aneurysm repair, major replacement surgeries, revision surgeries, and cardiac surgeries. Okay. Good. So hemoglobin is 12 grams. Fine. All the strategies can be adopted. Right. What is the next investigation you do in CBC? Total count
Yes, sir. Total.
to look for the any infection, silent infections in the chest. What are the investigations you do?
Um, r- RFT, sir. Blood urea serum creatinine and
Okay. Renal function test. You're gonna look for the blood, urea, serum, creatinine. Right. Expected. Fine. Then
serum electrolytes, sir.
serum electrolytes. Why serum electrolyte? Which electrolyte is more important?
Sir, sodium.
Sodium. In what way?
Sir, because we are giving more fluids to this patient, sir. So most of
Okay. So you're worried about sodium levels. So what is the preoperative need to know the sodium? No use at all. We are more concerned about the potassium. Why?
because in neuromuscular Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there may be hyperkalemia.
Yeah, okay. So there may be hyperkalemia. Is that so? Any of the reasons why potassium level is important?
Hypokalemic periodic paralysis.
Hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, muscular dystrophies, all agreed, fine. If the patient, if you're planning to give choline, all right, if you're planning to give succinylcholine, what
Yeah.
happens, These tend to produce hyperkalemia.
Yes.
In muscular dystrophies, hyperkalemia is very common for choline, and another reason is malignant
Hyperkalemia.
hypothermia. These two reasons why you look for the potassium in the preoperative period. Of course, potassium has got no role with the malignant hypothermia. Potassium I want to stress because these patients tend to have silent myopathies which can get exaggerated when you give a choline. Right. Serum
Okay.
electrolytes. Then any of the investigations you do.
And ECG, sir.
ECG, of course, in a 10 years kid, doesn't matter much. If at all ECG, you can find the features of pulmonary hypertension, okay, or any additional cardiac abnormalities. If at all it will get reflected. Otherwise, ECG will be normal most of the time. If the mediastinum shift is there, you can have, depending upon the axis of the heart, you could have a different changes in the ECG, right? So if the axis is affected, ECG can get affected.
And uh, chest X-ray.
Chest X-ray, fine. Chest X-ray, what do you look for?
Sir, any lung
Okay, lung infections, right? Position of the trachea,
yes.
right? Because that's more important because when the trachea is grossly deviated, you have to plan for intubation, use appropriate size tube. So that's the reason why you look for the position of the trachea. And of course, looking at the lung parenchyma, whether there is any associated infection or any consolidation. Fine. What other investigations you do?
Pulmonary function test, sir, since it is
Okay.
scoliosis.
Pulmonary function test. If at all, what do you expect?
There'll be a decrease in the restrictive pattern.
Okay, what is the restrictive pattern? What are the things you decrease?
Sir, I will see first FEV1 by FVC
What happens
ratio
to the FEV1?
decrease, sir.
Decreased. Okay. What happens to the next thing you look for?
FVC, sir.
Okay. What happens to the FVC?
It is a decrease, sir.
Okay, it decreased. Which is more decreased? Hang on for a minute. Just hang on for a minute. I got a call there. Yes, doc, we can continue. Right. So you got a decrease in FEV1, you're gonna FEC is also going to get decreased. So
Yes.
which is more affected?
FEV1 is more decreased.
FEV1 is more decreased. So what happened to the FEV1 ratio?
FEV1 ratio is normal, sir. Like it's,
Okay. When you expect FEV1 to be more decreased, what happens to the ratio basically? You said FEV1 is going to get more affected.
yes,
If it is more affected than FEC, what happens to this ratio normally?
it is. It will be around 72.
No. Will it be normal or will it be decreased?
It will be normal, sir.
Okay. Let's assume, as you said, FEV1 is more decreased than FEC, right? What happens in this case if FEV1 is more decreased? Just look at this ratio and tell me. As per your statement, FEV1 is more affected, right? If
Yes.
the FEV1 is more affected than FEC, what happens to the ratio?
It will be decrease in the total.
As per your statement, FE1 FEC ratio should be decreased or normal, right? Is
Yes.
it right in a restrictive lung disease? In the beginning itself, you told me the patient is the capacity is decreased, inspiratory capacity is decreased, patient's
Yes.
total lung capacity is decreased. So which will be more affected?
Vital capacities.
Okay, this is absolutely wrong. Okay, both
Yes.
FEV1, right? Both FEV1 is decreased and FEC is decreased, but in this patient, FEC is more decreased in restrictive lung disease compared to FEV1. So the FEV1 ratio, either it can be normal at the initial stages or it will be decreased when the restrictive lung disease or increased when the restrictive lung disease is progressed, because FEC is more affected. The lung capacity and volumes are more affected. FEV1 is nothing but the flow rate. So only when there is an obstruction, you're more concerned about flow rates. In restriction, lung is not expanding. You're more concerned about the capacity or the volumes. Okay. So FEV1 is predominantly affected in obstructive lung disease. Forced vital capacity basically nothing but the volumes which are more affected in restrictive lung disease. So FE1 FE ratio will be either normal or it will be increased because FEC is more affected than FEV1. Got a point?
Yes.
Never make any mistake in this. Don't get confused. This is very, very basic point. Okay. FEV1 is flow rate. So only flow rate will be affected only when there is obstruction. FEC is a vital capacity. Vital capacity or volume will be affected only when there is a restriction. Okay.
Yes.
Right. So that's how you look in the PFT. Any other investigations you do?
And ABG, sir.
ABD, right? Baseline ABG, of course, not indicated in this patient. If the patient is having a severe disease, you're going to have a baseline PaO2 and baseline PaCO2. Fine. Next. Any other investigations?
2D echo can be done.
Two-dimensional echocardiogram. Okay, that's to look for the pulmonary pressure
Pulmonary
and
pressure.
any associated congenital heart
Heart disease.
disease, right? So these are the some common basic investigations you do. You evaluate the patient, right? Now let's assume that you have prepared a patient, right? Patient is ready for surgery. 2D echo is normal, hemoglobin of 12 grams, and you expect, since it's a thoracolumbar more than 10 vertebra, you expect a loss of more than 1 liter. Generally, it will be bleeding more than 1 liter, right? Now, what are the anesthetic goals or the anesthetic challenges?
Blood loss will be more. So
Okay, this patient tend to have high blood loss. So one of the investigation you forgot to tell is the blood grouping and typing. Okay.
Yes.
Right. So you expect a high blood loss. So high blood loss is the first anesthetic challenge. Fine. Next one.
And prone position.
Positioning of the surgery. Okay. Position of surgery is going to be prone, right? So that can be an tricky anesthetic challenge in a pediatric patient. Next one.
Next is hypothermia, sir. Since
Okay,
it
so it's a
might be
long duration surgery. Chances of hypothermia is going to be very high. Then,
then a spinal cord monitoring, sir.
okay, spinal cord monitoring, very important. So when there's a spinal cord monitoring of potentials, you're going to modify your anesthetic management. Let's see how it is going to affect it later, right? So spinal cord damage is high. Then,
And if they are doing anterior approach lung isolation,
okay, so if they're paying anterior approach, lung isolation technique, okay?
and air embolism, sir, venous air
Okay,
embolism.
venous air embolism. Of course, it's very rare, right? So these are the different anesthetic challenges you're gonna face when you anesthetize these patients. So with these challenges in mind, you have to modify your anesthetic technique. You have to plan your anesthetic technique such a way that you're gonna counteract all these things. Good. Okay. So blood loss we spoke already. So how to manage blood loss and how to reduce the transfusion, everything is being discussed. Okay, right. Now let's come to the position. As an anesthetist, you're gonna how the position is going to affect you for an anesthetist in this patient. What
Um,
position normally is adopted?
Sir, prone position is normally
Okay,
adopted.
so let's mostly majority of the time they do prone position because posterior correction is recommended. Anterior correction has got a high risk of bleeding. Okay, and it needs lung isolation. So many problems are there. So majority of the centers, unless needed, they don't do anterior approach. So prone position is adopted. Okay, so what are the issues of prone position?
Sir, they'll be decreased in the cardiac output, decreased in the stroke volume.
Decrease in the cardiac output, decrease in the stroke wall. Is it matter much?
And it's,
Okay, no, cardiovascular issues are going to be very less.
sir, head should be maintained in neutral position, sir.
Okay,
Otherwise,
head
the
should be maintained in neutral position. Very good. When there is extreme extension at the or extreme flexion in the cervical thorax or the cervicothoracic junction, chance of spinal cord compression or ischemia could be there. Fine. So head should be in neutral posture compared to the spine. Then
um, shoulders should not be over abducted, sir.
shoulder should not be over abducted. Why?
Because it might cause brachial.
Okay, so it can cause traction on the brachial plexus, so that can affect, can result in brachial palsy post-operatively. There is no hyperabduction of the shoulder. So gently in scoliosis correction, the arms are adducted and kept close to the body. Okay, we don't have any abduction in the shoulders. Only for the lumbar spine, we tend to put the shoulders in the 90 degrees flexion and abduction. Whereas for the thoracolumbar scoliosis, the arms are fully abducted. Okay, right. So when the
And
arms are abducted, what happens, you don't have any access to IV line. So securing IV line has to be very proper. Okay. Securing IV lines has to be proper and clear. All right. Right. Next,
eyes should be properly padded
eye
uh,
should be properly padded.
to avoid
What are the
compression.
problems can happen in the eyes?
So post-operative visual loss might happen.
Okay. What are the reason for post-operative visual loss?
Sir, if it is a long duration surgeries,
Okay.
um, there might be and if the horseshoe shaped head is headrest is used, it might cause compression to the
Compression on the eyes. Okay. What are the different types of post-operative vision loss in a patient going for scoliosis surgery?
sir, central
Okay. Central retinal artery occlusion, anterior ischemic optic neuropathy,
and
posterior ischemic optic neuropathy, then cortical blindness, and lastly conjunctival edema. Okay, so these are the different ways patient can have visual issues after the operation. Of course, the ischemic optic neuropathy has got a very poor prognosis. Okay, right? So central retinal artery occlusion, anterior ischemic optic neuropathy, posterior ischemic optic neuropathy, cortical blindness, and lastly conjunctival edema or corneal aberration or scarring. or conjunctival edema, right? So what are the risk factors of having an ocular injury in a kyphoscoliosis?
Sir, if horseshoe shaped headrest is used,
Okay,
and,
horseshoe shaped headrest.
and if blood loss is more, and if blood loss is more than 2 liters,
Right. Blood loss more than 2 liters, fine.
and if there is usage of vasopressor, then we'll use.
Usage of vasopressors, is that so? I don't think so. That's not a big deal. Okay, blood loss more than 2 liters. Duration of surgery. Okay. Duration of surgery more than 180 minutes. Okay. Or sometimes 180 minutes for conjunctival edema, 6 hours for ischemic optic neuropathy. Okay. If the duration of surgery is more than 6 hours, for the chance of ischemic optic neuropathy is very high. The patient duration more than 180 minutes, then conjunctival edema is very high. Okay. Then
Yes. If the patient
diabetic patients,
has
diabetes,
obesity, diabetes,
obesity, right? So diabetes patients, obese patients using a horseshoe headrest, blood loss of more than 2 liters, duration more than 180 minutes of 6 hours for a chance of ischemic optic neuropathy is going to be very, very high. So these are things you have to look for when you are planning to avoid an ocular injury, right? So head maintained in neutral, shoulder not hyperabducted, then secured IV line properly, then eye positioning, right? What are the things in the prone position?
sir.
What are the things in the prone position?
Sir, all the pressure points should be properly padded,
Okay, all the pressure points should be properly padded. Lovely.
and genitals and breast should be free
Breast
from
and genitals should be properly padded. Then
uh,
abdominal,
abdominal and thoracic compression should be.
abdomen and thoracic compression should be avoided. Why?
If there is abdominal compression, there will be engorgement of the spinal vessels, and there will be increased bleeding, sir, when there is instrumentation.
Okay, fine. So when there is abdominal compression, when the IVC is getting compressed because of the external pressure, or when the femoral veins are compressed at the inguinal junction, what happens now? Blood tends to tract other way as an alternative route to reach the heart. So when they try to find an alternative route, they choose the Behçet's plexus, okay, venous plexus in the spinal cord. So that got venous engorgement in the spinal cord level, and that can result in pharyngeal bleeding. Okay, so that's why abdominal and thoracic compression has to be avoided. Perfect. Then pressure points, abdominal compression, eye padding, securing eye lens properly, shoulder abduction, head has to be maintained in the proper position. Okay, good, excellent. Any other thing in the prone position?
Sir, stretcher should be
Right.
should.
So stretcher should be available immediately after the outside the OT, because in case if you want to turn supine for any reasons, it has to be immediately accessible outside the OT. Excellent. Agreed. Good. So blood loss we have discussed, positioning of the patient we have discussed, and hypothermia. So what are the things you do to avoid hypothermia?
Sir, I will use warm fluids
Okay, warm fluids.
and
You should use
um,
intraoperative fluid warmers. All
yes,
right, and then radiant heaters.
yes, sir.
Yeah. So these are ways to avoid hypothermia. What are the different mechanism of temperature loss under anesthesia?
Sir, most of the surface area is open, so there will be
What are the different mechanisms? First, tell me that different mechanism of hypothermia.
um, sir, coagulation will be affected.
Different there are different mechanism of heat loss. Yeah, you're right. Radiation,
uh, conduction
conduction,
and convection.
convection, then evaporation.
Yeah.
All right. Of these mechanism, which is the most common reason for having an hypothermia under anesthesia?
Radiation.
Radiation. Okay. 40% of the heat loss is due to radiation, radiatory heat loss. What does mean by radiation heat loss, Shruti?
Um,
Okay, so nothing but when you tend to lose your body temperature to an object which you are not in direct contact with each other, that is called as the radiatory heat loss. Like you can lose your body temperature to the OT table, you can lose your body temperature to the IV stand, you can lose your body temperature to the sheets which are away from you. So anything which are not in contact with you can act as a heat exchanger with you, and you tend to lose the temperature from your body. So this type of non-conductible objects where tend to lose your heat which are not in direct contact with that. So that is the radiation heat loss. Okay, so that is the reason for 40% of the main reason for patients losing temperature. Second reason is going to be the convection, which comes to 20 to 30%, right? And next comes the conduction of 10 to 15%. Last year around 5 to 8%, we tend to have evaporative heat loss. Okay, so what are the ways to avoid heat loss? You said warm fluids and radiant heater. Anything, any important way, cost effective way?
insulin. So,
Which is
warm.
which is very mandatory, particularly in pediatrics.
Wow. OT temperature is decreased.
Okay, 30 temperature, right? 30 temperature. Okay, right. Next, any other important way?
Insulation, sir, like we can
Right, fine.
get the body.
Insulation, fine. Then any other thing, very common thing.